Jake Morrison stared at the blinking signal on his cracked navigation screen, nursing what had to be his fifth cup of recycled coffee that shift. The bitter taste matched his mood. 3 months behind on docking fees, fuel gauge sitting at 20%, and his last 2 salvage runs had turned up nothing but space junk. At this rate, he'd be selling Murphy's Law for scrap by next quarter. But this signal was different. Iris, run that frequency again. Tell me I'm not seeing things. His ship's AI responded with her usual calm tone. You are not hallucinating, Jake. That is indeed a genuine distress beacon. HFY military design, pre-contact era. Based on the signal degradation, I estimate that vessel has been drifting for approximately 200 years. Jake sat up straighter, his fatigue suddenly forgotten. 200 years? You're sure? 97% certainty. His mind started calculating. Old HFY tech was rare. Most of their pre-contact ships had been destroyed or dismantled after the peace treaties. Collectors paid stupid money for intact components. Even basic stuff like NAV systems or weapon mounts could fetch enough credits to keep him flying for months. Any life signs? Negative. However, I am detecting minimal power signatures. Something aboard that vessel remains operational. Jake drummed his fingers on the console. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. The Vale Nebula wasn't exactly a tourist destination. Pirates loved the sensor interference. Plus, dead ships sometimes stay dead for good reasons. Radiation leaks, biological contamination, booby traps left by previous salvagers who got territorial. But he was broke. Really broke. The kind of broke where you started eyeing your emergency rations and wondering if you could stretch them another week. Alright, what the hell? Set intercept course. The approach took 40 minutes of careful flying. The nebulous purple clouds played tricks with his sensors, and twice Jake thought he'd lost the signal entirely. Then it appeared, emerging from the cosmic fog like a ghost ship from old Earth legends. The HFY vessel was huge. Easily 3 times Murphy's Law in size, with aggressive angular plating that marked it as military grade. But time hadn't been kind. Micrometeorite impacts scarred the hull like acne. Entire sections had gone completely dark. One of the main engines looked like it had torn free and drifted away decades ago. Jake guided his ship alongside, searching for an intact docking port. The magnetic clamps engaged with a heavy thunk that made his whole ship shudder. He sat there for a moment, listening to the groaning metal as the 2 vessels settled against each other. Still no life signs? He asked, already knowing the answer but hoping anyway. Confirmed. No biological readings. Life support is functioning at approximately 15% capacity. Breathable, but I recommend limiting your exposure time. Jake pulled on his environment suit, the fabric patched in 3 places from previous close calls. He checked his plasma cutter twice, made sure his scanner was fully charged and grabbed an extra battery pack. At the airlock he paused, one hand on the release mechanism. Iris, if something happens to me, wipe my browser history before sending any distress calls. Your attempts at humor do not effectively mask your anxiety, Jake. Yeah, well, I'm working on it. The airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The smell hit him immediately, seeping through his suit's filters. Stale recycled air mixed with something organic and rotten. The kind of smell that meant something had died aboard this ship, probably a long time ago. Jake activated his helmet lamp, and the beam cut through absolute darkness. The corridor stretched ahead, too tall for human proportions. Everything was built for beings bigger than him. The walls were covered in HFY script, angular letters that looked more like claw marks than writing. Emergency lighting strips flickered occasionally, casting weird shadows that made his heart jump. His footsteps echoed too loud in the silence. Every creak of settling metal made him flinch. This was the part of salvage work nobody talked about. Not the money or the adventure. But the creeping dread of walking through dead ships where whole crews had lived and worked and died. Energy signature is coming from deeper in the vessel. Iris guided him through his helmet comm bearing 270, approximately 80 meters ahead. Jake followed his scanner's readings through a maze of corridors. He passed crew quarters with belongings still scattered around. A cup frozen mid-fall. Pictures on walls showing HFY families he'd never meet. It felt wrong, like walking through someone's tomb. The cargo hold doors loomed ahead, massive slabs of metal sealed by locks that had failed sometime in the last 2 centuries. Jake cut through them with his plasma cutter, the bright arc of energy almost blinding in the darkness. The doors groaned as they slid apart, metal scraping on metal. Then he saw her, and his brain just stopped working for a second. Chains. Heavy brutal chains bolted directly into the bulkhead. and bound by those chains was a HFY female, nearly 7 feet of predator crouched against the wall. Her golden fur was matted and dirty, streaked with old blood and grime. She was painfully thin, ribs visible through her fur, but her eyes blazed with fierce intelligence and barely contained rage. Behind her, 3 tiny shapes huddled together. Cubs. Babies. Their oversized ears twitched at every sound, and their spotted fur looked soft despite the dirt. They couldn't have been more than toddler age. "Oh hell," Jake breathed. "Iris, what am I looking at?" The female's lips peeled back, revealing fangs that could easily tear through his suit. A translator unit sparked uselessly at her throat, damaged beyond function. She yanked against her chains with shocking strength despite obvious starvation, positioning herself between Jake and her children. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his plasma cutter, then stopped. This wasn't a threat. This was a mother protecting her kids. This was someone who'd been left here to die slowly, chained up like an animal. Moving slowly, deliberately, Jake raised both hands, palms out. He set his plasma cutter down on the deck and kicked it away from himself. The female tracked every movement, muscles coiled tight, ready to attack the second he made a wrong move. Jake pointed to himself. "Jake," he said, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to try anyway. He gestured to the chains, then made a braking motion with his hands. "Help. I'm going to help you." The female stared at him, those amber eyes searching his face for lies, for hidden threats. The cubs whimpered softly behind her. One of them, the smallest with more spots than the others, peeked around her mother's leg to look at the strange creature with the glowing face. After what felt like forever, the female gave the tiniest nod. Jake approached the chains carefully, pulling out his toolkit. The locks were ancient but still functional, sealed with mechanisms he'd never seen before. His hands shook slightly as he worked. The female watched his every move, and he knew if he did anything she interpreted as threatening, those claws would be the last thing he ever saw. "Iris, scan the ship's logs. I need to know what happened here." He worked in tense silence, only the soft clicking of his tools and occasional whimpers from the cubs breaking the quiet. The locks were complex, designed to resist tampering. Whoever had chained her here had wanted to make damn sure she stayed put. Finally, Iris spoke in his ear. "Jake, I have accessed the ship's logs. The female is designated Sarah, former commander in the HFY military. She was convicted of political dissent against her government. The sentence was erasure. They imprisoned her aboard this vessel with her offspring and set it adrift. It was intended as a deterrent to other dissidents." Jake's hands froze on his tools. "They just left them here? Left kids to die in space?" It appears to be standard protocol for political prisoners in HFY culture. Slow death as a warning to others. Something hot and angry burned in Jake's chest. He'd seen a lot of cruel things in the Outer Rim. Pirates who'd kill you for cargo. Corporations that treated workers as disposable. But leaving children to starve slowly in the dark? That was a different level of wrong. The last lock clicked open. Sarah lurched forward, catching herself against the bulkhead. Her legs shook with weakness, but she immediately turned to her cubs, checking each one with gentle paws that completely contradicted every threatening gesture she'd made. Her touch was tender, loving, desperate. She ran her paws over their faces, their bodies, checking for injuries with the care only a parent could show. That's when the alarm started screaming. Red emergency lights flooded the cargo hold, spinning and pulsing. A klaxon wailed from every speaker, the sound painful even through Jake's helmet. His blood turned to ice water. "Jake, evacuate immediately." Iris's calm voice had cracked into urgency. "The reactor is destabilizing. The ship was rigged with an automatic failsafe. We have 51 minutes before it reaches critical mass." Jake's eyes locked with Sarah's. She couldn't understand his language, but the universal sound of imminent death needed no translation. Her ears flattened against her skull. She scooped up her cubs, all 3 of them crying now, their small voices breaking with terror. "Move. We have to move now." Jake shouted, gesturing frantically toward the corridor. They ran. Jake led the way, Sarah following close behind with her cubs clutched to her chest. The ship groaned around them, metal shrieking as ancient systems began their final shutdown sequence. They burst through the airlock into Murphy's Law, and Jake's heart dropped straight through the floor. His ship was tiny. Built for 1 person, maybe 2 in an emergency. There was no way it could hold a 7-foot HFY warrior and 3 cubs. Not with life support already running on fumes. Not with oxygen recyclers designed for 1 human's needs. The clock was ticking. 50 minutes until the reactor turned them all into expanding plasma. And Jake had absolutely no idea how to save them all. Jake's head felt like someone had taken a plasma cutter to his skull and forgotten to turn it off. Every thought came slow and painful, like wading through thick mud. Something cool pressed against his forehead, and he forced his eyes open despite the effort it took. Sarah's face hovered above him, her amber eyes showing concern he didn't know HFY were capable of expressing. She was applying some kind of green moss to his forehead, her massive paws surprisingly gentle as she worked. The moss had a weird minty smell that actually helped clear his head a bit. How long? Jake managed to croak out. His throat felt like sandpaper. 37 hours, Iris replied, her voice somehow conveying relief despite being an AI. Your neural pathways suffered significant trauma from the link. The human brain was not designed to process 2 ships worth of data simultaneously. You're fortunate to be alive, Jake. However, our current situation remains critical. Engines are completely offline. Life support is operating at 38% capacity and dropping. We're drifting in the middle of an asteroid field with no means of propulsion. Jake tried to push himself up to sitting position. Big mistake. His vision swam, nausea rolled through his gut, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Sarah immediately pressed him back down with one large paw on his chest, making a low rumbling sound that didn't need translation. It meant stay down, you idiot. Yeah, okay, I get it, Jake muttered, not fighting her. From his position lying flat, he could see the cubs watching him from across the small cabin. The youngest one, the little female with the spotted fur that he'd pulled from the collapsed bulkhead, was inching closer. Her huge eyes studied him with that mix of curiosity and caution that kids everywhere seem to have. Status of our passengers? Jake asked, keeping his voice low. All 4 HFY are healthy, though still significantly malnourished. However, Jake, we have a serious problem. Murphy's Law was designed for maximum 2 human occupants. With 5 beings aboard, we're consuming oxygen and food reserves at an unsustainable rate. At current consumption, we have approximately 4 days of breathable air remaining. Food stores will last perhaps 6 days with strict rationing. Jake looked at Sarah, and even without working translators, he could see she'd understood the tone if not the words. Her ears had flattened against her skull. She knew they were in trouble. Iris, bring up the resource display. Visual format. A holographic screen materialized above Jake's chest, showing their supplies as colored bars. Red for critical, yellow for concerning, green for adequate. Everything was firmly in the red zone, the bars visibly shrinking as he watched. Oxygen. Water. Food. Power. All of it declining toward zero like sand through an hourglass. Sarah leaned closer, studying the display with intense focus. Her tactical mind was clearly working, even if she'd never seen human technology before. She pointed at the declining bars, then at herself and her cubs, then made a gesture that looked like cutting or reducing. Yeah, Jake said quietly. We need to ration everything. Strict conservation. Over the next few hours, Jake taught Sarah resource management through a combination of gestures, diagrams that Iris projected, and sheer determination. He showed her how the water recycler worked, how every drop had to be captured and reused. He demonstrated the food dispensers' reduced portions, dividing their supplies into tiny meals that would stretch their reserves. Sarah absorbed it all with the discipline of someone who'd commanded troops in the field. She immediately began implementing the measures, showing the cubs how to use only the minimum water for drinking, how to eat slowly to make the small portions feel like more. Her warrior training translated well to survival situations. What surprised Jake was how quickly the cubs adapted. Despite everything they'd been through, despite being trapped on a dying ship with a strange alien creature, they showed remarkable resilience. The youngest one especially seemed fascinated by Jake. She followed him everywhere as he moved carefully around the cabin, checking systems and making repairs. When Jake jury-rigged a better water reclamation system using parts from a damaged air filter, the little cub chirped excitedly. She watched his hands work, then tried to mimic his movements with her small paws, fumbling with a loose bolt like she wanted to help fix things too. Jake couldn't help but smile. You want to be an engineer when you grow up, kiddo? She tilted her head at his voice, not understanding but seeming to like the tone. She made a soft trilling sound and held up the bolt she'd been playing with, proud of herself. What's her name? Jake asked, looking at Sarah and pointing to the cub. Sarah made a series of sounds, melodic despite the growling undertones of HFY language. When Jake looked confused, she seemed frustrated by the broken translator. She thought for a moment, then touched her daughter's spotted fur gently. She pointed at the viewport where stars shone through the darkness of space, then back at the spots on her cub's golden fur. Stars and spots, Jake said slowly. Stella? That's an old Earth name. Means star. He looked at Sarah. Can I call her Stella? Sarah tilted her head, considering, then gave a slow nod. She seemed to understand he was trying to honor her daughter, not replace her original name. It was a gesture of respect. The other two cubs, both males, were less bold but equally curious. Sarah introduced them through gestures and expressions. The larger one with darker fur Jake named Ben. The middle one with lighter coloring became Leo. Ben, Leo and Stella, Jake said, committing the names to memory. Okay. We can work with that. By the second day adrift, they'd fallen into a strange routine. Jake would work on repairs, trying to coax life back into damaged systems. Sarah would maintain their supplies and keep the cubs occupied. Stella remained Jake's shadow, learning by watching. Ben and Leo started playing a game that involved jumping between the cabin surfaces in the reduced gravity, their natural grace making Jake feel clumsy by comparison. On the third day, Sarah attempted to communicate her story through gestures and Iris's partially functional translation matrix. The words came broken, glitchy, but Jake pieced together the horror of what had happened to her. War hero. Decorated commander. Political dissent. Cubs taken away. Mate executed. Sentenced to erasure. I'm sorry, Jake said softly, and even without perfect translation, Sarah seemed to understand the sympathy in his voice. Her ears drooped slightly and she pulled her cubs closer. But what puzzled her most, Jake could tell, was why he'd saved them at all. In Kethrii culture, Iris explained, loyalty belonged to your clan first. Outsiders were viewed as tools or threats, never family. Jake's willingness to die for strangers made no sense in her worldview. On the fourth day, as oxygen levels dropped into truly dangerous territory, Iris detected something. Jake, I'm picking up a transmission. Very faint, from the shipping lane approximately 200,000 kilometers from our position. Jake pulled himself to the navigation console, hope surging despite his exhaustion. Can we reach it? Negative. With engines offline, we cannot achieve the velocity required. However, I have a proposal. We could use all remaining reserve power to send a single high-powered distress burst. If any vessel is monitoring that frequency, they would detect it. What's the catch? If no one responds, we will lose all power reserves, including life support. We would have perhaps 6 hours of breathable air remaining. Jake stared at the screen, at the faint blip representing their only hope. It was a gamble. All or nothing. If nobody heard the signal, they'd all suffocate in the dark. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. She didn't need the technical details explained. She understood they were facing a choice between certain slow death or possible rescue. Jake pulled up the probability calculations. Iris displayed them honestly. 37% chance someone was listening. 42% chance they'd respond if they heard. 16% overall probability of rescue. 16%. Sarah studied the numbers, then looked at her cubs. Stella was sleeping against Jake's leg, trusting him completely. Ben and Leo were curled together, too young to understand how close to death they were. Sarah met Jake's eyes and placed one large paw over his hand on the console. The gesture was clear. She trusted his judgment. She trusted him with her children's lives. Jake took a deep breath. Iris, send the signal. Everything we've got. Acknowledge. Diverting all power reserves to communications array. Transmitting now. The ship hummed, every system straining as power flooded into the communications array. For 5 seconds they broadcast their position, their situation, their desperate need for help into the void of space. Then everything went dark. Emergency lights died. Temperature control stopped. The gentle hum of life support fell silent. In the sudden darkness, Jake could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast. Sarah gathered her cubs close, making soft comforting sounds. In the faint starlight coming through the viewport, Jake could see her holding them, memorizing their faces, preparing to say goodbye. Hours crawled past. The air grew stale, harder to breathe. The cold seeped in, making everyone huddle together for warmth. Stella whimpered softly, and Jake held her close, this tiny alien child who'd adopted him as protector. I tried, Jake whispered into the darkness. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. Sarah made a sound, soft and almost sad. Through Iris's dying translator, 3 words came through clearly. You showed kindness. Thank you. More time passed. Jake's chest felt tight, each breath requiring conscious effort. This was it. This was how it ended. At least they weren't alone. At least, what? Brilliant, Blinding light flooded through the viewport. Jake's exhausted brain struggled to process it. A ship. There was a ship outside, decelerating toward them, its running lights like angels in the darkness. They were saved. But as Jake's vision adjusted as he saw the markings on that approaching vessel's hull, his relief turned to ice-cold dread. HFY military insignia. Hunter-class vessel. And Sarah had gone completely rigid, a sound like a wounded animal escaping her throat. She recognized that ship. These weren't rescuers. These were the people who tried to kill her the first time. The comm system crackled to life with a burst of static that made Jake jump. Then a voice came through, deep and rough like gravel grinding under boots. It spoke in HFY, harsh consonants that sounded more like threats than words. "Iris, translate," Jake said quietly, though he already knew this wasn't going to be good news. His AI's voice came through, overlaying the translation. "Sarah, daughter of the Red Pride. What an unexpected surprise to find you alive." Sarah's entire body went rigid. Her lips pulled back in a snarl, showing every one of those sharp teeth. She knew that voice. Jake could see it in the way her ears flattened, the way her claws extended involuntarily. Power began flowing back into Murphy's Law systems. Not from their own reserves but from outside. The HFY ship had locked onto them with a tractor beam, feeding just enough energy to keep life support running. Jake recognized the tactic immediately. They wanted their prisoners alive and conscious. "I am Commander Thex," the voice continued, Iris translating each word with mechanical precision. "We tracked the derelict's distress beacon, expecting to find nothing but wreckage and bones. Instead we find you quite alive. This is problematic for us." Jake's hands curled into fists. He forced himself to stay calm, to think tactically. "What does he want?" he asked under his breath. Thex continued, and this time Jake heard amusement in that grinding voice. "Human mechanic. I have no quarrel with you. You simply stumbled into an unfortunate situation. Release the prisoners to my custody, and I will transfer 50,000 credits to your account. Enough to buy a new ship. A better ship. All you must do is walk away." Jake looked down. Stella was pressed against his leg, her small body trembling. Her wide eyes looked up at him with complete trust. Ben and Leo huddled behind their mother, too young to fully understand but sensing the danger. Sarah met his gaze, and in her amber eyes he saw resignation. She expected him to take the deal. Why wouldn't he? They were strangers. She was a convicted criminal by her people's laws. Taking the money was the smart play. "No," Jake said simply, his voice carrying across the comm. The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours. Then Thex laughed, a sound like metal scraping on metal. "You would die for refugees? For another species' political criminals? This makes no sense, human." "Yeah," Jake said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I would die for them. Because it's the right thing to do." "The right thing," Thex repeated, like he was testing the words in his mouth and finding them distasteful. "Humans, your Federation will not go to war over one salvager. They will file a complaint, perhaps issue sanctions. Nothing more. We will take what we came for, mechanic. You have one final chance. Die a meaningless hero or live as a wealthy man. Choose quickly." The comm went silent with a harsh click. Moments later, Jake heard a new sound. High-pitched whining. Cutting torches. They were going through his airlock, not even bothering with the docking protocols. Just cutting their way in like he was already dead. "Iris, seal all internal bulkheads. Emergency protocol. I'm going to make this ship very unfriendly for anyone trying to board." "Jake, they have superior numbers and weapons," Iris replied, her tone almost pleading. "The logical choice would be to negotiate." "The logical choice is to fight," Jake interrupted, already moving toward his tool locker. "Now help me turn Murphy's Law into a nightmare." He grabbed everything he could carry. Spare power cells. Emergency foam canisters. His welding torch. A cargo net. Some magnetic clamps. None of it was designed as weapons, but Jake had spent years making things work in ways they weren't designed for. Sarah watched him with intense focus, her tactical mind clearly working. When Jake started pulling up ship schematics on a portable display, she leaned in close, studying the layout. He pointed to corridors, made cutting gestures, showed her where doors could seal, where gravity could be reversed, where atmosphere could be vented. She understood immediately. Her ears perked forward, and she made a low rumbling sound that might have been approval. She pointed to a junction, then made a motion like an explosion. Jake nodded. Yeah, they could rig that. For the next 10 minutes, they worked together in frantic preparation. Jake rerouted power cells to create false heat signatures that would read as people on scanners. He rigged doors with manual override releases that Iris could trigger remotely. He reversed the gravity plating in 3 key sections. He set up the emergency foam dispensers to trigger on his command, ready to blind and trap anyone who came through. Sarah showed him structural weak points in the walls, places where the ship's frame would amplify sound and vibration, creating disorientation. Her knowledge of combat tactics combined with Jake's intimate understanding of his own ship created something unexpected. They weren't just defending. They were turning Murphy's Law into a weapon itself. "Take the cubs to the emergency pod," Jake said, guiding Sarah toward the most secure compartment on the ship. It was tiny, barely big enough for the 3 small HFY, but it had independent life support and could seal completely. "If this goes wrong, if I can't stop them, you trigger the manual release and let it take you away from the ship." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a decision that surprised him completely. She scooped up Stella and pressed the trembling cub into Jake's arms. She pointed at him, then at Stella, then made a protective gesture. She was trusting him with her daughter. Then Sarah picked up a heavy piece of metal debris from the floor, testing its weight and balance. Her meaning was crystal clear. She wasn't hiding in any pod. She was fighting beside him. "You sure about this?" Jake asked, even knowing she couldn't fully understand his words. Sarah bared her teeth in what might have been a smile. Or a promise of violence. Probably both. The cutting torch broke through the outer airlock. Sparks showered into the corridor. Jake could see shadows moving on the other side, at least 4 large HFY warriors preparing to breach. "Stella, Ben, Leo, emergency pod." "Now," Jake said firmly, pointing. The cubs understood tone if not words. They scrambled into the tiny compartment, Stella looking back at Jake with frightened eyes. "I'll be okay, kiddo," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "Your mom and I, we've got this." The airlock exploded inward with a burst of superheated metal. 4 HFY warriors poured through the breach, each one massive and armed with energy weapons that glowed with deadly promise. They moved with military precision, spreading out to cover angles of attack. Jake triggered the first trap. The gravity plating in that section reversed instantly. 2 warriors slammed into the ceiling with bone-crushing force, their weapons clattering away as they struggled to orient themselves in the sudden reversal. The other 2 tried to compensate, but that moment of confusion was all Sarah needed. She moved like liquid death, all grace and controlled violence. Her makeshift weapon caught the 3rd warrior across the throat, a precise strike that sent him choking to the floor. The 4th warrior turned to fire at her, but Jake had already triggered the next trap. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, separating the 4th warrior from his team. Through the ship's camera feeds, Jake watched as he vented atmosphere from that isolated section, then restored it, then vented it again, keeping the warrior disoriented and oxygen-deprived. But more were coming. Jake could hear them cutting through secondary access points, coordinating their assault. These weren't random pirates. They were trained military and they were adapting to his tricks. Sarah and Jake fell back, fighting a running battle through the narrow corridors of Murphy's Law. Every step was planned. Jake triggered traps in sequence. Emergency foam erupted from hidden dispensers, temporarily blinding attackers. Doors sealed and unsealed in confusing patterns, making the warriors second-guess every corner. Sounds echoed through the walls in ways that made it impossible to tell where defenders actually were. One warrior got close, his claws raking across Jake's shoulder and drawing blood. Sarah was there instantly, her counterattack brutal and efficient. Another warrior tried to flank them, but Jake vented that entire corridor section, the sudden decompression slamming the warrior into the far wall. They were holding. Barely. But Jake knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Then Commander Thex himself entered through the breached airlock, shoving his disoriented warriors aside with contempt. He was massive, nearly 8 feet tall, with black fur scarred from countless battles. His eyes locked onto Jake with predatory focus. "Clever," Thex growled, his translator working perfectly. "But ultimately futile." He moved faster than something that size should be able to move. In seconds he had Jake pinned against the wall, one massive paw wrapped around Jake's throat. Claws pricked his skin, drawing small beads of blood. Jake struggled to breathe, black spots dancing in his vision. "Why?" Thex demanded, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why would a salvager die for refugees? What profit is there in martyrdom?" Jake struggled to force words past the pressure on his throat. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because they're people. Because someone has to give a damn." Thex's eyes widened, not with anger but with something like incomprehension. The concept seemed to break something in his worldview. In Kethrii culture, every action had transactional value. Every choice was calculated for benefit. Sacrifice without personal gain was literally inconceivable. That moment of confusion, that philosophical short circuit, cost him everything. Sarah struck from behind, her improvised weapon catching Thex across his shoulder joint with devastating precision. He roared in pain and fury, releasing Jake to spin toward this new threat. He backhanded Sarah with tremendous force, sending her crashing into a bulkhead. She hit hard, blood streaming from her mouth, but rolled with the impact and was already moving again. Jake saw his chance. His last chance. His hand found the emergency release panel, the one he'd been slowly inching toward throughout the conversation. Iris, jettison port section. Now. Jake, you're going to kill us all? Do it. The explosive bolts fired. The entire port section of Murphy's Law, where most of Thex's warriors were trapped in Jake's maze of tricks, separated from the main hull with a violent explosive crack. The decompression was catastrophic. Jake felt himself pulled toward the breach, grabbed a handhold and held on with desperate strength. Sarah had caught a support beam, her superior strength keeping her anchored. Thex, caught mid-attack, grabbed for a handhold but his blood-slicked paw missed. He slid toward the open void, claws scraping across the deck plating. For just a moment their eyes met. Predator and prey. Warrior and mechanic. Two beings from different worlds, different philosophies, different values. Then Thex and his remaining warriors were sucked into the black vacuum of space, their screams lost in the void. Jake slammed his hand on the emergency seal panel. Bulkheads crashed shut, cutting them off from the breach. But it wasn't over. The jettison section's reactor went critical, its destabilization sequence completing. The explosion lit up space like a new sun, the blast wave hitting Murphy's Law like the fist of an angry god. Alarms screamed. Every system showed critical failure. The ship tumbled end over end, completely out of control. Iris, what's our situation? Catastrophic. We're caught in a gravity well. We're entering the atmosphere of the planetary body below. All engines offline. Maneuvering thrusters destroyed. We're going to crash, Jake. And there's absolutely nothing I can do to stop it. Jake dragged himself toward the cockpit, every muscle screaming. Through the viewport he could see clouds approaching. Fast. Too fast. They were going to burn up on entry or slam into the surface at terminal velocity. Either way they were dead. He grabbed the manual controls anyway, knowing it was pointless but unable to just give up. Sarah pulled herself into the co-pilot seat, her face streaked with blood and determination. She placed one paw over his hand on the controls. Together. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. The ship hit atmosphere and the world became fire. The last thing Jake remembered was the sound of trees exploding. Not burning, not cracking, but exploding from the sheer force of Murphy's Law tearing through the jungle canopy at terminal velocity. Then everything had gone black. Now he was waking up and everything hurt. Birdsong. That was the first thing his brain registered. High-pitched and melodic, nothing like Earth birds but beautiful in its own alien way. Jake forced his eyes open, squinting against shafts of sunlight filtering through leaves overhead. Purple leaves. Too purple. Wrong color. His confused brain struggled to make sense of that detail. Jake Morrison, please remain completely still. Iris's voice cut through the fog in his head. You have sustained 3 fractured ribs, a moderate concussion, severe bruising across your torso and legs and multiple lacerations. However, against all probability you are alive. Jake tried to take inventory of his body. Yeah, alive was a generous way to put it. Every breath sent sharp pain through his chest. His head throbbed like someone was using it as a drum. Moving even his fingers took concentrated effort. The others, he managed to croak out. His throat was raw, probably from screaming during the crash. He didn't remember screaming but he must have. All survived with minor injuries. Sarah has been maintaining watch over you for approximately 8 hours. She refused to rest despite her own injuries. Jake turned his head slowly, carefully, and immediately wished he hadn't. The wave of nausea and dizziness almost made him black out again. But through the spinning vision he saw Sarah sitting about 10 feet away. The cubs were clustered around her like fuzzy satellites, all 3 curled up against her body. Sarah looked like hell. Her golden fur was matted with dried blood, dirt, and what might have been engine coolant. Fresh scratches covered her arms and face. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. But the moment she saw Jake's eyes open, her whole posture changed. Her ears perked forward and relief flooded across her feline features. She made a soft chirping sound, and the cubs immediately scrambled to their feet. Stella practically threw herself at Jake, making distressed noises and trying to nuzzle against him. Her small paws patted his face gently, like she was checking to make sure he was real. "Hey kiddo," Jake whispered, managing a weak smile despite the pain. "I'm okay. We made it." Through his blurry vision, Jake could see what was left of his ship. Murphy's Law had wrapped herself around 3 massive trees like she was hugging them. The hull was torn open in multiple places, systems sparking and dead, but the basic structure had held. Somehow, impossibly, Jake had managed to glide them into the jungle canopy during those last terrifying seconds. The trees had acted like a net, cushioning their impact just enough to keep them from being liquefied on impact. The odds of pulling that off had to be astronomical. Jake didn't believe in luck, but maybe the universe had decided to cut him a break this one time. "Where are we?" Jake asked, trying to focus on practical matters. "Where? Not how. Not why we're alive. Just where." Kepler 442b. A marginal colony world, mostly used for agricultural research. There is a human research outpost approximately 200 kilometers to the northeast. They should have medical facilities and long-range communications. 200 kilometers. Jake almost laughed, but his ribs convinced him that was a terrible idea. 200 kilometers through alien jungle with broken ribs, a concussion, 3 traumatized cubs, and a wounded HFY warrior. Sure. Why not? What else could possibly go wrong at this point? He tried to sit up, operating on pure stubborn determination. His body immediately vetoed that decision with a symphony of pain. Sarah was beside him in an instant, making a low warning sound deep in her chest. She pressed one large paw against his shoulder, not hard, but firm enough to communicate her meaning clearly. "Stay down. Rest. Don't be an idiot." "Yeah, okay, I hear you," Jake muttered, relaxing back against the ground. The dirt was surprisingly soft, covered in some kind of moss that actually felt pretty comfortable. "Small blessings. Can we call for help?" Jake asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. "Negative," Iris confirmed. Communications array was destroyed during the jettison sequence. Backup transmitter was damaged in the crash. Long-range sensors are offline. Short-range scanners are barely functional. We are, essentially, stranded. Jake closed his eyes and took as deep a breath as his broken ribs would allow. Right. So they'd survived the impossible crash, but now they were stranded on an alien world with no communications, limited supplies, and serious injuries. The universe's sense of humor was really something else. "What about supplies?" he asked. "I have completed an inventory. We have approximately 4 days of emergency rations, enough for all 5 of you with strict rationing. Water purification tablets will last perhaps 3 days. After that, you will need to locate fresh water sources. I have identified several streams within 1 kilometer using passive sensors. Medical supplies are limited. 2 emergency medkits survived intact. 4 days of food. 200 kilometers to travel. That meant they needed to cover 50 kilometers per day, which would be challenging even for someone in perfect health. With his injuries, with cubs who couldn't walk that far, it seemed nearly impossible. But impossible seemed to be Jake's specialty lately. Sarah was watching him with those intense amber eyes, waiting to see what he would decide. She'd already demonstrated she wouldn't leave him behind. Even if he told her to take the cubs and go without him, she wouldn't. She'd appointed him as part of her pride now, and HFY didn't abandon pride members. Jake studied the cubs. They looked tired and scared, but physically they seemed okay. Stella was already trying to climb on him, her natural kitten energy starting to return. Ben and Leo were exploring the immediate area, poking at strange plants with cautious curiosity. Kids were resilient. They bounced back faster than adults. That might be the one advantage they had. "All right," Jake said, forcing determination into his voice. 200 kilometers. We can do this. Iris, plot the most direct route to the research station. Avoid steep terrain if possible. We'll move slow, take breaks, hunt for food along the way. Jake, in your current condition. In my current condition, I'm alive, which is more than I expected an hour ago. We rest today, let everyone recover a bit. Tomorrow morning we start walking. Sarah tilted her head, not understanding his words but clearly reading his body language and tone. She could see he was making a plan, preparing for action. She made a rumbling sound that might have been agreement or approval. Jake looked up at the purple canopy overhead, at the alien sky beyond. They'd survived the explosion. Survived the crash. Now they just had to survive the next 200 kilometers. How hard could it be? His ribs chose that moment to send a fresh wave of pain through his chest, reminding him exactly how hard it could be. "We're going to make it," Jake said, more to himself than anyone else. "We've come this far. We're going to make it." Stella chirped and curled up against his side, her small warm body radiating trust. Ben and Leo returned from their exploration, settling down near their mother. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch all approaches, protective even in her exhaustion. And Jake closed his eyes, letting his battered body rest while his mind planned their next impossible survival challenge. Tomorrow they would start walking. Tonight they would simply be grateful to be alive.